Garrish, and we're going to be talking about inventorying and using a pasture inventory. Yes, sir.
All right. This might be a little anticlimactic after Alan's presentation. I should have done this yesterday. Yesterday's today. 40-20 hindsight. I'll try to not make it incredibly boring. So we're going to talk about what is a pasture inventory first, and then what do we use it for. To me, it's taking your grazing management to the next level is understanding what you have. And I work with a lot of people who don't keep real good records, who don't really know what they have to work with, and so they don't operate anywhere near as effectively as they could. And so the pasture inventory is a tool to help be able to manage much more effectively. And like any business, especially if you're selling something, or you're making something, or all kinds of things, it's really good to know what you have to work with, what is on the shelf. And the pasture inventory is a process of determining what do you have on the shelf. Your pastures, your ranch, your farm is selling feed to the livestock. So I'm going to, and this is why I said I hope I don't make it incredibly boring, because I'm going to talk about how we assess how much feed we have available in a pasture. And it goes back to when I was in the research business for so long. So the inventory, it's what do you have for feed that day? So in research, the way we measure the yield of a pasture is we have one of those metal frames and you put it down and you clip it off. That's called clipping quadrats. Not quadrants, but quadrats. That's the specific term we use in research. It's clipping a quadrat. All right. Every other instrument or tool that we use to measure pasture yield, and I'll talk about some of those other things, it comes back to a clipped quadrat. This is what everything is calibrated to. If you are good at this, it says 85 to 90% accuracy. Another way of expressing that is your standard error is less than 10 to 15%. When we would first have students come in at the start of the summer, summer work students, and they're clipping quadrats, our standard error goes up. And then you train them, you remind them, you show them how to do things, and as the summer progresses, the standard error comes down because they're doing a better job of it. But 85 to 90% accuracy is what we get on this. However, it's inconvenient, it is tedious, and it's expensive. To get a representation of what the yield on an acre of pasture is, 1 acre, the absolute minimum number of quadrats that you can cut is 10. What do we do when we have 5 acres, 50 acres, 500 acres? You don't want to be doing this, all right? I personally have probably cut 100,000 of those quadrats. No, sorry. I have cut personally, 10,000 plus. I have made other people cut well over 100,000. All right, so another device that came along is something that's called a rising plate. And the rising plate has that flat 1 square foot, and it's all made out of aluminum. And the handle slides down through it, so the plate would rest on the top of the sward. You push the handle through it, and it measures the height. That's actually much more convenient than clipping quadrats. Guess what? For it to be accurate, though, it's got to be calibrated to clipped quadrats. And so you've got your square down there on the ground, and so you're going to run this through it, and you do, 100 of these, and you can get a pretty good prediction based on that of what the pasture yield is. 85 to 90% accuracy if it is properly calibrated. Now, rising plates cost somewhere between $400 and $1,400, and I think actually you can get digital ones now that cost $2,000. There's another meter called Pasture Probe, which is an electronic device that you touch it to the ground, and it sends out an electrical pulse that gets bounced back to the instrument, and the speed of that bounce back is determined by, guess what? The volume of biomass around it. Oh, yes, but it's got to be calibrated with clipping. $900 to $3,000, but it's pretty cool. You just walk across the field and you put it down and beep, beep, and it's going to tell you that your yield is 2,473.961 pounds per acre of forage. That's pretty precise, but it's not necessarily accurate. Guess what? A yardstick. You can take and stick a yardstick into the pasture. Of course, you've got to calibrate it by clipping quadrats. And we started doing that with every sample that we cut. And we made an amazing discovery. The taller it is, the more of it there is. The yardstick, well, you can get a yardstick for free at the lumber store sometimes if it's got somebody's advertising or promotion on it. But there's a very special yardstick. Anybody have a sword stick? About 2 or 3 people. Okay, so UT Extension or NRCS, you can get them at their offices, and it's a yardstick. You know, it's got one side that has measurements on it, you know, just like a regular yardstick, but the other 3 sides are loaded with all kinds of information. Not only does the height of the pasture affect the yield, but the density of the stand does, and what type of pasture it is. And the proper way you use a sword stick, and most people don't know, because you'll see pictures in extension publications or videos where someone is down on their knee with the yardstick and they're reading it like this. The yardstick, the sword stick, and by the way, the sword stick was invented in Missouri. All right, the way you properly read is this: extend your arm, you look down, the last clearly read number, that is the height of the pasture. And we define that as the height below which 90% of the forage mass occurs. Not massacres, but mass occurs. All right, so from that work, we generated a table like this. And that table is printed on your sword stick. So you always have it there to refer to. You'll see we have 6 different types of pastures. We have stand density. We would consider this an excellent pasture. This is a good pasture. This is a fair pasture. We don't go any lower than 60% stand density because the shape of how plants grow, if they become less dense, the plant changes the shape of how it grows, and you no longer have accuracy. So all these numbers in here, that's the dry matter yield per acre inch of each of those type of pastures. And if you look at something like the bluegrass white clover, and now don't think of a ragged little thin worn out piece of bluegrass. Think about the nicest luscious bluegrass you have seen, and it's thick with white clover, and it's really dense. That stuff can have 500 to 600 pounds of dry matter forage per acre inch. So 6 inches of really thick bluegrass white clover can be somewhere between 3,000 and 3,600 pounds of dry matter per acre. You know, that's 1.75 tons. Most bluegrass isn't like that. So you see, as we reduce the stand density, the yield per acre inch goes down. And, look at this one. If it's only a fair stand, only 150 to 250 pounds per acre inch, okay? Tall fescue with legumes, which a lot of you would have, it doesn't yield as much per inch as bluegrass white clover, but it gets taller, all right? Orchard grass out in the pasture. Yesterday, there was a fair bit of orchard grass out there, so I know it grows here. But orchard grass is a looser bunch than what fescue is. And so the yield per acre inch on the orchard grass legumes is lower than fescue. So you see now that you have to be able to assess what kind of pasture do I have here to work with? What's the composition? What's the density? Then we measure the height. What we saw out there yesterday, I would call a mixed pasture. So we would use that mixed pasture line, but you know what? We had Johnson grass this tall out there, didn't we? The yardstick doesn't go that high. You can't measure these really tall forages, sorghum sudan, Johnson grass, big blue stem. You can't measure their yield accurately by height because structurally they're different than these type of species, okay? But this was the key thing that got me thinking about what's the yield per inch of pasture. And the answer we got on that table was pounds of dry matter per acre, right? Well, that doesn't necessarily tell us what the animals are going to eat because we have a residual out there that we have to leave behind. That told us our yield down to bare ground, okay? It didn't tell us the yield of what the animal's going to be able to eat out of that field. So we have to go through some mathematical calculations. We have to set our target level of utilization. We also have to factor in what does an animal eat, in pounds per head per day, and it comes in there. By the way, I didn't mention, in clipping quadrats, there are 9 sources of error in there. In research, in designing experiments, we look to minimize sources of error. So you clip this, you bag it, you weigh it, you dry it, you weigh it again, and when you go through that whole process, statistically speaking, there are 9 sources of error in clipping a quadrat and drying a sample. I just wanted to throw that out there. All right, so what did this one back here say? Oh, expressed as a livestock-based number. I wanted to make it easier so you didn't have to go through all the calculations every time, from your sword stick yield. And so I started thinking about cow days. It's not a real official, defined term. We'll see why it's not an officially defined term. But to me, a cow day, because most of the time I hung around with about 1,200-pound cows, and for a moderate level of performance, they need to eat about 2.5% of their body weight a day. So 1,200-pound cow times 2.5% of body weight equals 30 pounds per cow per day, and that's what I called a cow day. And so I'm going to show you how we use the cow day process. So if you take that whole table of yield per inch that we had for the different stand densities and the different forages, the average on that was thick grass yields about 450 pounds per acre inch, average grass 350, thin grass 250. Okay, that makes sense? That the yield would be different by each layer inch in the canopy? Well, if we divide that by 30, and I did that again, all right? If we divide that by 30, we would come up with 8, 11, and 15. 8 cow days per inch in thin grass, 11 cow days per inch in average pasture, 15 cow days per inch in thick, excellent pasture. All right. The thin pasture, we probably shouldn't graze as severely because it needs a chance to grow more roots, make more tillers. So rather than striving to harvest 8 cow days per inch of forage, let's just make it 5. And we know we're treating our pasture better. 11 is almost 10, so let's just make that one be 10. 15 is 15. I did this because most people in their head can multiply by 5, or they can multiply by 10. Now, 95% of the pastures in the United States are not thick, excellent, wonderful pastures. So almost nobody has to worry about multiplying something in their head by 15. But 5 and 10 we can do. So here's how the process is actually going to work. Come on, back up. So we take our sword stick and we measure that there's 12 inches of grass out there. We want to leave a 5-inch residual. So our objective is going to be to harvest 7 inches of grass off of there. And we looked at it and said, well, that's average grass. So what that means, the cow grazing from 12 inches down to 5 inches, we're going to harvest 70 cow days per acre, which means if we had 70 cows in our herd, we'd fence off 1 acre with our poly wire, put the herd in there for 24 hours. The cows should have eaten enough forage for a moderate level of performance, and we should have left the appropriate residual out there. Does that make sense? That we can think rather than in pounds per acre and going through all these different calculations, we just assign some amount of yield to each inch of grass that we want to harvest off of there. So that was pretty simple. So what is CDA is cow days per acre. Now mine was 30 pounds. I said because we had 1,200 pound cows, and I just based it on kind of average level of performance, which was 2.5% of body weight intake. So it's a cow day per acre, amount of cow eats each day. You can tailor it to your cow size, so it could be anywhere from 25 to 40. If you have a 1,000-pound cow, your cow day is different from somebody who has 1,500-pound cows, where they're eating, 37 pounds a day or something. Okay, if the only thing we're ever going to use this process for is what's happening on our own farm, that's fine, that's wonderful. Just use your cow day. What if you also are going to run stockers, though? A stocker doesn't eat the same amount as a cow, so let's have a stocker day, and it's going to be anywhere from 12 to 20 plus pounds, depending on, whether it's 400, 500, 600, 800, 900 pound stocker. All right. Let's run some sheep also. So are we going to have a ewe day per acre? And a ewe day per acre is 3 to 5 pounds of forage per day. And now we are back to, you better have a pretty good spreadsheet to figure out what all these animals are eating and how you're going to allocate feed. All right, so there we are. One day you're going to forget to take your yardstick with you. And there you are, you're standing out in the grass, and you don't have your yardstick, but you suddenly realize that you've been measuring this grass for the last 5 years, and suddenly in your mind, you know what a field that you're going to harvest 10 inches off, 6 inches off, 4 inches off. You know what it looks like, and you've been using this multiplying by 10 factor for so long that it's just automatic, and suddenly you realize that all you have to do is look at that and say, hey, that's 65 cow days per acre. And if you're far away from home on a pasture walk, on a consulting job or something, and you say it with enough confidence, people are going to believe you. All right? So that looks like 65 CDAs to me. But I suddenly look at the guy's animals and realize he does, in fact, have 1,500-pound cows. So now my CDA number, what I'm seeing, doesn't match with his cows. And I need to do something different. And that brings us to standard animal units. So most people east of the plains don't use the terminology of AUM, which is animal unit month, or AUD, which is animal unit day. West of the plains, I think I talked about that line the other day, Pierre, Grand Island, Nebraska, Oklahoma City. West of that, that's what we think in terms of is AUMs, animal unit months, AUDs, animal unit days. And when you go to thinking in terms, I mean, looking at your pasture yield in terms of animal unit days, you can easily visualize that, and then you just have to figure, well, how many animal unit equivalents do I have in this herd? And so this is where I really started formally doing pasture inventories. When we were in Missouri, you know, every 2 or 3 weeks, and we had 260 acres is what we had there. You know, I'd walk across the whole farm through all the paddocks and, you know, say, okay, I got 3 days in this one, I got 2 days in this one, I got 5 days over here. And I would just kind of go across the whole farm and run a tally in my head that would say, at the end of it, how many days of grazing do I have if I don't get a drop of rain and I don't grow any more feed? And as long as I could see 40, 50 days of feed ahead of me, you know, I didn't have to worry about selling animals or buying feed in or anything like that. So I've been doing this a long time informally. Then when I went, and in research, of course, we record everything. And you might be shocked to learn that when I came home from my job at the university at the end of the day, I didn't really want to record anything. You know, I didn't want to have my own data and stuff like that. And Dawn grinned a little bit back there, it looked like. I also hated talking on the telephone. She wondered why I never called my parents, I never called my siblings. If, you know, a neighbor had called, you know, I just go, you know, and I spent too much time in the office on the telephone. Last thing I wanted to do when I came home was talk to somebody on the telephone. I didn't want to keep data. But after we moved west, and I went into the consulting business, and suddenly I went from managing 260 acres to 1,000 acres, and the herd got a whole lot bigger than what we had in Missouri. I realized I probably ought to do this a little more carefully. And for clients, because I was telling them how important it was to know what your feed supply is, I needed to create a tool by which they could easily assess their feed supply and then plan out their grazing ahead of it. So it was about 2005, 2006 when I actually started doing the process that I'm going to show you now of how we do a pasture inventory and what we use it for. All right, so the standard animal unit is a 1,000-pound animal, and in the official definition of the Society for Range Management, it says 1,000-pound cow with or without calf at side. Well, that's kind of a odd definition, since we know that a cow with a calf suckling its side eats way more than a cow without a calf. So there's a little confusion in the definition, but what is not ambiguous at all is how much that actually is. A standard animal unit day is 26 pounds of dry matter forage consumed. I don't even worry about that anymore, you know, what the poundage is. All right, so standard animal units, if you have more than one class of livestock, it begins to make sense to use one standard measure of forage yield. If you are a grazing professional and you are dealing with a whole bunch of people who have a whole bunch of different livestock, but you want to be able to compare things be from one client ranch to another, it needs to be standardized. And then the one that I'm really sure all of you have been thinking about is bragging rights at the coffee shop. You know, we need to quit bragging about what the weaning weight of our calves are and stuff like that. And what we should be bragging about at the coffee shop is how many AUDs per acre are we harvesting, because that's the actual measurement of productivity of your ranch, is AUDs per acre. Well, we did that again. So I started, I recalibrated my eye, and I'm going to talk about how you calibrate your eye, from seeing cow days to seeing standard animal unit days. And by the way, 65 cow days and 77 standard animal unit days are equivalent values. So I can look at a pasture now pretty well anywhere, and well, that's 77 AUDs per acre. Why estimate it by animal use? No tools needed. There's only one tool that I need to assess yield in a pasture now, and that is my eye. The trained eye. Back in the 1970s, the New Zealanders were looking for tools for their farmers to be because they were 50 years ahead of us in adopting controlled grazing, management intensive grazing, short duration, high intensity grazing, whatever term we want to use. They were 50 years ahead of us. So in the 1970s, they were looking for easy to use tools for their farmers to do exactly what I'm talking about here: pasture inventories, grazing wedges, things like that. And they determined that the trained eye is statistically as accurate as any tool that we use in research for measuring pasture yield. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I do pasture walks and workshops and stuff, and that's one of the exercises we would have done in the field. Yesterday, had we had my wits about me and said, hey, we need to do this, we didn't do it. But a lot of people say to me, you're doing this 30 years, how do you expect us to guess that? Any of you, if you decided you wanted to do this in 30 days' time, you can be as accurate as I am. And we'll go through the process of how. Animal use relates specifically to your stock, not just the yield. You calibrate your eye with grazing records. And so, grazing records, man, what does that mean? What do I need to do? We'll see. So, with each paddock move, you start out, everybody knows what wagging is, just a wild guess. All right. Sometimes you just start there. You look at the pasture and say, okay, I think that's 50 AUDs per acre. If you have 50 1,000-pound animals, what that means is you set your polywire fence up for 1 acre, you put the 50 head on there. If you come back tomorrow and it's grazed down like that, you were wrong. It was only 30. If it's still this tall, you were wrong. It was about 70. And so you look at it again, make your adjustment, set the fence up again, and see what happens. If you do 31-day moves, assessing it each day and adjusting, in 30, that's what the New Zealanders showed, 30 repeated measures, and your eye will be trained to see that yield. Now, they did it, when the New Zealanders did it, they did it as kilograms per hectare. They were looking at the dry weight of the forage. I want to cut that whole measurement of pounds, tons out and put it right to the animal use, because that's what we're really trying to accomplish. Remember, how many sources of error did I say there were in clipping quadrats? 9. How many sources of error are there in a visual estimate of the yield of the pasture? 1. You guessed wrong. That is the one source of error. And so all you have to do is adjust in, fine-tune it, and you can easily do this. And I think that's what I just said, yeah. Estimate AUDs before each move compared to what actually happened. All right, so what do you need to know is how many head, and I think most of us know how many animals we have, how long were they in the paddock. Unless you black out for a couple of days, you're probably going to know when you put them in, when you took them out, and then how big is the paddock. The how big is the paddock used to be the more difficult piece of this. So in your record, if you take, got to point it here, how many head, and put it in terms of animal units, and the way we do that, because it's 1,000-pound increments, you just add up the total weight of your herd, cows, calves, bulls out there, ewes, lambs, whatever you have, add up the total weight, divide it by 1,000, and that's how many animal units you have in the herd. So we're going to have the number of animal units. How long are they in the paddock? That's days. And then how big is the paddock? We have animal unit divided by the size of the pasture, and you got animal unit days per acre. So in your grazing record, that's what needs to be recorded. How big is this pasture? When did you put them in? When did you take them out? How many animals or animal units? That's all it takes to create the animal unit per day system. You want to have a map with acres on it. This is so easy to do now, with Google Earth or AgWeb, all these mapping programs. You can create your map, you can measure the acres, and when I go out to do the inventory, that's actually what I carry with me is the pasture map, and I ride you'll see how I actually do it. I ride the ATV through and record my estimate just right on the map. I don't have my phone in my pocket. Of course, there are apps for doing this now. You could have just your map on there and record a number of AUDs into your phone on your map, or you could actually get a software package. Maya Grazing from Australia, Pasture Map from the US, AgWeb, which I'm not sure where AgWeb comes from, but there are grazing management softwares now where you can do your pasture inventory right into a software package, which is going to create automatically some of the uses that I'm going to show here in a bit. All right. Also, a lot of us now on our phone. All right, because, I got to do this. This is what we would call a unit of record or a paddock. And of course, you might be strip grazing through this. This might represent multiple days of grazing, not a single day of grazing. And if you want to keep a record on a daily basis of what you're allocating, one way is with a GPS app on your phone, you can ride your ATV around the perimeter of the area you're setting up for that day's move. You can walk it, you can ride your horse to do it. But all you have to do is go around the perimeter of today's grazing allotment, and you have got the area. That's pretty easy these days. Okay, so I use Maya Grazing, and so these are the two pivots. This is the 300-acre pivot. This is a 150-acre pivot. This is flood irrigated land. This is desert out here. We also have rangeland up on the mountain here that we don't always use. But so right now, this is my stocker herd. Actually, today it's not there. If I actually showed the computer screen for today, they would be the stocker herd would be over here. They got moved Wednesday. The cow herd is now here in about that much of the pasture. They got moved this morning. But on the Maya grazing, you know, it's just a drag and drop thing. I want to point out, the only fences, permanent fences that we actually have are the outside perimeter, the inside circle. All these other lines, they aren't actual fences. They define, again, my unit of record. So I do my inventory looking at each one of these segments. Another way that you can measure area in a pasture is if you, and I know there's no place in Greene County that probably looks like this. Not very much square and flat stuff here. But if you're from Middle Tennessee, where there's some square and flat stuff, this is easy to do. You remember how out at the farm yesterday, there's a pasture, there's a central fence, the water lines along that central fence. That's what we call a flexible grazing cell. They do then all this additional splitting with movable polywire fences in there. If you put some forethought into building your permanent fences, what we would call the corridor fences, and I have this distance here as being 435 feet for ease of illustration. Why would I want to build a corridor 435 feet wide? 43,560 square feet in an acre. So that would mean if I put my line posts in on a 50-foot spacing, the strip between each pair of line posts is 1/2 acre. And if from my inventory it tells me I should be feeding 2 acres a day, I know to set that fence at the 4th post, and I'm going to have 2 acres in there. So if you can lay out things in a consistent way with actual parallel fences, you can use your post spacing as an acreage counter. This is just another example of setting up a flexible cell. This guy had a rotational grazing with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pastures. These were hay fields up here. But he had 7 pastures he was rotating through. He wanted to be able to go to daily moves. And so we just took each one of those existing pastures, split it as close to the center as we could, put the center water line along it. And now he has multiple grazing corridors that he can set the polywires anywhere. No, it's not perfectly laid out like the previous slide I showed, but you can set it up close enough. And I've got the widths of the different corridors in there. When we sent him the plan, we sent him for each one of those red line fences, those splitter fences down the middle of the paddock. Each one of these pastures has a different post spacing on that center fence because they're all different widths. But we had them all, I don't remember if it was a 1/2 acre or 3/4 of an acre that we set them up for. But his strips between posts, the area was the same in each of the bigger pastures. And that's because we put in line posts at a different spacing. All right, when we do an inventory, we look at every pasture, even the ones that have just been grazed. And why is that? Because the inventory is a measure of the bags of feed you've got on the shelf. And a pasture that's just been grazed off is an empty shelf. And so when you're doing the inventory, that has to be factored in that you do not have any feed on this many acres. What does an inventory tell us? What you have available today. Like I say, it's a snapshot in time of what do you have available today. Yes? It also is going to tell you what you can expect to have in the future, and that's another step, but I'll show you how that is. Is your inventory increasing or decreasing as you're progressing through the season? It's going to give you a warning that either you need to be planning on destocking because you're running out of feed, or you could buy in some more livestock, or you could make this field for hay if you needed to. So we look to see whether it's increasing or decreasing. It's also going to tell us how a change in management could be affecting our future forage supply. All right, so this ranch used to be called Circle Pie. It changed hands January 1st, 2021. It's now the Hanging T Ranch, and we have a hard time saying Hanging T rather than Circle Pie, but there it is. So I said, okay, so we have 300-acre pivot, 150, and here you can better see we just have the outside circle, inside circle. Actually, there is a third fence. Each pivot has a single wire fence, that high tensile, that connects the inside and outside circle. That is so one energizer can run the entire property. When we first set these up, we had the two inside circles on separate solar energizers, and that actually worked fine. And I've mentioned that there's also, a big range component to this, and so one of the cowboys came one day and said he needed a solar energizer to take up on the range, because sometimes the Forest Service will require them to, set up a polywire fence to keep the cows out of a particular area. And so the cowboy, he needed the energizer for about 2 weeks. I had just moved the cows off of the big pivot over to the little pivot, and so I didn't need to have the inner circle fence energized. So we used to have the fence warehouse for our company, American Grazing Land Services, used to be at our place. It's now over the mountain where our son lives, but our warehouse used to be there at our home, and I didn't have a solar energizer in inventory. So I told him, just go out to the big pivot, take that one, and use it up there, bring it back, and it'll all be fine. Well, it never came back. And, I went through the rotation over here. It was time to go back to the big pivot. I didn't have power over there. And I said, you know what? Rather than putting a solar energizer out there, I'll just build this 1,000-foot of fence and hook them together, and it'll run off the mains energizer. A couple years later, same thing over here. They needed a solar charger. I said, just take that one and don't worry about bringing it back. And so I put a tie-in fence there. So this is what the unit looks like. As I said, these are my units of record. So the way that I do the inventory, I do this from the ATV. The house is right up here, so I come into, the pasture, start here. And when I come into the field, I look and I say 43. And as I'm riding across the field, 45, 47, 44, 45, and whatever number is in my head, when I pass that imaginary line, the far edge of the pasture, that's what gets recorded in the inventory. And so I just ride in a circle doing that, and this is the pattern I usually do, and it takes me about 45 minutes, and that includes, it takes me about 30 to 35 minutes to ride and do the inventory, and then, because I already have the spreadsheet set up, it's about 10 to 15 minutes to do the rest of the process. It's important, visually estimate forage supply. This is a big range operation in western Montana. I'm trying to remember exactly what's there. Probably 1,200 irrigated acres, and on productive land, we do an inventory every 2 weeks. And then there's 50,000 acres of rangeland, and the range we do once a month because it grows slower, so it's not changing as fast. And so the two ladies here, these are the wives of the brothers who owned the ranch. The way they did inventory on range, they would go out on horseback, equipped to camp for the night. I mean, they were always looking for a reason to go ride the range, and so it would be a 2-day deal to ride over 50,000 acres of rangeland and inventory what the range was doing. So there's different ways you can approach this. Start with more than one set of eyes, that says, and the reason for that is when you are learning, if there's 2 or 3 people go out to do it, and you have a little bit of discussion about what you think is out there, you will actually take fewer days, fewer moves to get everybody's eyes trained to seeing the same thing. All right, so this was a place in South Missouri that our oldest son was managing in 2011, 2012. And this is, if I could ever think about this, I think this is about 1,500 acres in that unit. What I'm illustrating by doing these is it's easy to do on a 20-acre place, but it's also easier to do when you're dealing with hundreds or 1,000 acres. So this is the travel route for this one, and we're always trying to minimize backtracking. And so you figure out the most expedient route and cover the ground as fast as possible. And that was 1:15 to 1.5 hours to do that. All right, so now we're going to look at what does the grazing wedge, or excuse me, how do we use the inventory? So the first product from the inventory is the grazing wedge. And the grazing wedge is your pastures sorted from highest feed availability to lowest, okay? Now this one is May 20th. Now I know here on May 20th, the tall fescue is already headed out and, you know, grass is this tall. May 20th for us, the snow just went off 3 weeks ago. So we really don't see any green grass, new green grass coming typically till late April, okay? We live at just under 6,000 foot elevation, so winter stays a long time there. So here, this is those pasture identification numbers, and then this is available, and this says CDA, and when I made this one, I think it's still using CDAs. So this is CDAs in the pasture. There's 3 lines on here. This first one is ready to graze. Because we have a distinct winter, long winter, that in the spring the grass, you know, starts growing. It's coming back from nothing, basically. So I like to have 25% of my paddocks at 30 AUDs per acre. That's my threshold to begin grazing. We do not have cattle on this unit over the winter. The cattle all winter down at the main ranch. They bring pairs up to me when I say I'm ready. And my key to being ready, like I say, is when 30% of my paddocks have at least, or 25% rather, when they have 30 AUDs per acre in, that's when I'm ready to start grazing. What I have found, if they bring up the cattle earlier than that and we get, you know, a cold snap or it turns into late spring, I'm going to run out of grass in a hurry. But if I've gotten it to this point, usually we can carry on pretty well. The optimal grazing line, I have set at 65 here. I have actually raised that to 77. Is it because I've made the pasture so much more productive and all that? No, it's because this is set up in CDA, and 65 CDA and 77 animal unit days per acre are equivalent yields. And what that yield is is 1 ton of forage harvested per acre in the grazing event. And that's the target that I actually strive for. It's a good balance of yield and quality of forage. And remember, I'm leaving about 40% residual because this is irrigated land, and we're harvesting 1 ton off, okay? So that's the optimal grazing line for me. And then this is the recovery line. And that will become more meaningful on the next one. So that was May 20th. The average cover, we would call it the average cover, was 20 cow days per acre. On June 5th, and this was done, and I should update these really. I actually haven't given this talk for a long time. On the first day, I think I asked how many people were Stockman Grass Farmer readers, and I said that I had just completed writing a 4-part series on pasture inventory. Well, I had just sent off the last installment on that the day that I chose what topics, what presentations I was going to do at this conference. And I'd been, working on pasture inventory and all that, and I said, hey, I ought to give this talk on pasture inventory. This is out of the mothballs. I did just a little tweaking on it. This is actually 2009. These 3 grazing wedges we're looking at are from 2009. 2009 was the best production year. We've been in Idaho 18 plus years now. 2009 was the best year, okay? There's a guy who just turned, a rancher, the ranch below us, he turned 90 this year, and 2009 was the best year he had ever seen, and he's 90. So this changed from May 20th, where I only had 25% of the paddocks up at 30 cow days per acre. This is June 5th, so this is just 16 days later. And look at that explosive growth. Okay. This is pasture being out of control, by the way. The recovery line in a perfect grazing wedge, each one of these bars is going to be hitting approximately at that recovery line. And then what you're striving to do is go into the pasture, and this is going to be high phase 2. Is when for me, this is when this occurs. It's high phase 2, and that's when you want to start grazing the pastures. All right, so 2009 was the last year that any hay was cut on our unit. And we had been cutting about 1/3 of the 2 pivots for hay each year prior to that. And so if you look at this is about about 1/3 of the place. So rather than, after grazing pasture 29, going all the way to 22, this is what we set aside for hay. And I could then come back and start grazing here and be much closer to the optimum grazing. So this is one more thing that a grazing wedge helps you identify. If you are the kind of operation where you are cutting some hay, it identifies the pastures that are out of control, and these are the ones we need to cut for hay. And it is my strong preference, if you are making hay, that we graze, that you don't set aside an area and say, this is my hay field, this is my pasture. We want to graze across everything and then use hay making to clean up any grazing mistakes that we made. So that's what we were doing there. That set-aside line, if it's above 90, I consider it to be hay more so than pasture. But the mean cover here is 53.5. So I'm going to show you what you do with 2 successive inventories. So May 20th, we had 20. June 5th, we had 53. So in 16 days, it increased by 33 cow days per acre. That's a daily growth rate of about 2. And because our cow days here are equaling 30 pounds of forage per day, not standard animal unit 26, the pasture's growing at a rate of 60 pounds per acre per day. And you've been to these grazing meetings and you've seen, people show you growth curves for pasture, and maybe it came from California, maybe it came from New Zealand, but rarely did that curve probably come from Tennessee, let alone from your county, and absolutely not from your farm. But you know what? If you do pasture inventories on a regular basis, you can create the growth curve for your pastures, for your properties. Pretty cool. What makes it even cooler, well, I thought that was going to be the next slide. It's coming up. So 33 days to grow 1 ton of feed. What if your growth rate is only 1.3 CDAs? Well, then it's 51 days to grow a ton of feed. Do you ever wonder, how you should decide how much recovery you're going to give to this pasture you just finished grazing? A lot of times you graze it and you hope it recovers, and what do you do if it's not recovered by the time you come back to it? If you could actually predict how long a recovery period you need based on when in the season you graze that pasture, it would be a whole lot easier to plan ahead. So this is the next product out of the pasture inventory. It's a spin-off from the growth rate we just calculated. You can see this is broken out in 2-week periods, and it tells me if I graze a pasture in the latter 2 weeks of May, it might take 50 days to recover. That is no longer true, because our season does start earlier, 2 to 3 weeks earlier than it did 10 years ago. But grazing in the month of June, I need about 34 days of recovery. Grazing in the first part of July, it's about 40, latter part of July, 48, and it goes on. So this gives, rather than just hoping that something is going to recover and wondering where to be, this pretty well tells you where you need to go. All right, know your critical levels. This is our critical levels. They're not going to be the same for you because you're in a different environment. When I do an inventory, if I'm between 35 and 45 across everything, I know that I'm properly stocked for our situation, and I don't need to make adjustments. When it drops below 30, it's time for me to be thinking about, hey, I got to do something. We got to think about weaning these animals. So now we run a cow herd and a stocker herd. So this is going to give me an idea of when we should be targeting shipping out stockers. If it's under 20, either the growing season is coming to an end or you're in deep trouble. Above 50 or 60, we can bring more cattle in. Greater than 60, usually it's something needs to be made into hay or just set back for stockpiling. And there's some more wedges here. I want to show you that I can properly manage. So there's a June 14th one, and you see most of those bars hitting the recovery line. June 30th, this is looking good. You wonder what a negative is? 0 on a grazing wedge is perfect residual, appropriate residual. A negative means I overgrazed it. I grazed it too severely. And then there we are on August 1st, and that's a pretty darn good wedge. That means animal number, forage demand, we're all properly working together. All right.
Any questions?
Boy, I wouldn't think so.
Anybody?
My feelings aren't hurt if nobody asks a question about this.
Okay. All right, Jim, thank you very much for your
You're welcome.
presentation. Thank you.